recording the vlog today on my phone, see if the quality is any better, any different. Um, Not really anything to update you on medically yet. The lab did screw up a couple of my blood tests, so I had to go back in yesterday and have those redone. I have a doctor's appointment tomorrow. Hopefully I'll get cleared to go back to work on Monday. But I'm still having some trouble getting around, so I don't know. I'll do an update tomorrow after my appointment. Anyway, not what I wanted to talk about today. I actually want to talk today about homosexuality, bisexuality, and the choice therein. So, I've been watching a lot of videos on YouTube because there's not a lot else to do, and specifically focusing in on the LGBT community, those that oppose us, those that support us, and the politics behind it all. The one thing that I keep coming across with people that oppose us is they seem to be under the misconception that being LGBT is a choice. It's not. And I realize nothing I say is going to convince them otherwise. But nonetheless, I'm going to tell my story and, take that for what it's worth. So, as I've mentioned in previous videos, I grew up in South Texas. When I say South Texas, I mean South Texas, the Rio Grande Valley. If you don't know where that is, look at a map. It's the very tip of Texas. If you know where Brownsville is, you know where the valley is. Brownsville is part of the valley. I grew up about 30 minutes from there. It was a half-hour drive, give or take, for me to get into Mexico. In fact, growing up, it was not unheard of to have a Mexican dentist because it was cheaper than getting dental work in America, which I actually did. And regret, I don't recommend going to Mexico for dental work. I learned that the hard way, but that's for another video. Actually, I've been on the news talking about that before. But, again, that's another story. The point is, that is a very heavily Catholic area. And in case you don't realize from my previous posts, I'm not Catholic. I never have been Catholic. But religion does play into my story. And I thank my mother because she never pushed me towards any religion. She is a Christian, although I believe non-denominational. She doesn't go to church, but she does believe in Christ as the Savior and all that. So she is a Christian. But she never pushed me. I did go to a Methodist church a couple of times as a little kid. I vaguely remember that. That's how little I was. I barely remember. And it wasn't really until 4th grade when I started to truly get interested in religion. And that was really only because my best friend at the time was very into her religion. She was being raised heavily Christian. And, as a kid wanting to fit in and do what my friends did, I went with her to church a lot. I would go to Bible study group on Wednesday nights, Sunday school, and my mom didn't go with me. I went with my friend and her family, and it was my choice. And it, didn't really appeal to me, but I was, with my best friend, and that was fun, and didn't seem to have any harm, until I went to a church camp. I was about 10 or 11 at the time. I want to say it was towards the end of 4th grade. maybe spring break of 4th grade. May have been spring break 5th grade. Anyway, I was somewhere in that general age range. And I went to church camp, and it was at a camp. It was an actual church camp with the cabins, and oh, you know what? It was over an Easter break. I remember that because they were doing Easter service and a mock crucifixion and a bunch of stuff like that. So it wasn't spring break, it was over Easter break. Or maybe, spring break is close to Easter break. I'm digressing. Anyway, the time frame isn't relevant here. What is relevant here is it was a sleepaway camp. And that's when I started to realize that maybe I'm not a Christian. And it didn't happen all at once. In fact, I was pretty convinced I was about to be a born-again Christian at first. I was ready to be baptized. They had a wonderful speaker, minister or pastor or whatever that the Baptists call their speakers. And he was a great talker. Wonderful. He was talking about being saved by Christ, and it was a very emotional speech. And at the end, he asked everyone to bow their heads and close their eyes in prayer. And before opening their eyes, if anyone was ready to take the next step to be saved, raise your hand. And I did. And I went and talked to somebody about being a born-again Christian, and I was ready to commit my life to Jesus Christ. And then the next sermon happened. And during that sermon are the words that turned me away from Christianity. The speaker said, the Bible says Adam and Eve, not Adam and Steve. And you may have heard that before from somebody else in the Christian faith. But it was that phrase that made me go, whoa, halt. Now, keep in mind, at this point, I didn't realize I was bisexual. I was still in elementary school. It hadn't really occurred to me that I was LGBT. What did occur to me is that love is love and love is not wrong. And in that moment, I realized, if this is what they believe, I am not a Christian. But I kind of held that in and went along to the next Bible study, where we broke up into smaller groups. And the adult leader of that group started talking about how you had to be a born-again Christian to get into heaven, and that nobody else was allowed in God's kingdom. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. That was like, okay, so what about Jews and Hindus and Buddhists and everybody that's not Christian in the world? Because Christianity is not the only religion. It's not even the biggest religion. And the fact that their God would condemn all these people to eternal damnation because they had a different faith didn't sit well with me. And then you add that to the fact that they're also against homosexuality and love. That was too much. I couldn't even stay for the rest of the camp. I called my mom, and she had my grandmother come pick me up, and I went home. And that wasn't the end of my Christian journey, but that was the point in which I realized their views were not mine. And so I would still pop into a study group every now and again with my friend, just to hang out, to be with my friends. but I didn't really believe that what they were preaching anymore. Fast forward to 7th grade, and I started to realize that I saw girls in two different ways. I had always liked boys. I mean, not always, but I had my little playground crushes and stuff. And I knew I liked boys. But I was also seeing girls in a way, in one of two ways. And there were the girls that I envied, that I wish I looked like. And there were the girls that I thought were pretty, but I didn't want to look like them. I wanted to be with them. And I saw a definite distinction in that. And that's when I started to realize I like boys and girls. But as I said, my best friend's a very Christian person at this time. So I was very scared to admit it out loud. I kind of broached the topic, like, oh, I read this article in a magazine about this girl, and, tried to phrase it like that. It wasn't well received. So I didn't really address it. I just kind of let it go. And then by the time I got into high school, I met a boy that became my first love, and it wasn't really necessary to address because I was in love with a boy, and we had a very complicated several years. It took that, I hesitate to even call it a relationship. That ordeal took 14 years. And so although I was still attracted to girls, it wasn't really a relevant point because I was in love with this boy. So I kind of suppressed it and didn't deal with it, or at least didn't verbalize it. Well, and then I should also mention, and this is relevant, back in high school, going back there, my junior year, I met my current best friend and wife, Shannon. And Shannon and I were very good friends, best friends. Although, contrary to what people evidently thought at the time, there really wasn't a romantic attraction between us back then. We really were just best friends. My biological father, who was still in my life at the time, was terrified that we were dating secretly because of how close we were, and that I was a lesbian. And it freaked him out. So, another LGBT moment that wasn't well received. And that one wasn't even true. It would take many years for me to realize that I was in love with Shannon. At the time, both of us were still in love with our high school sweethearts, if you want to call it that. So being together at that point wasn't even a thought for us. I guess they saw something we didn't at the time, because now we're married. Anyway, so moving on. After things finally ended with my first love, I was 28. Like I said, it took 14 years of off and on and in between, and that's not another video, that's a book. Anyway, so at 28, I realized there was this friend I had in Australia who I was attracted to. I realized now I was probably attracted to her because she reminded me a lot of Shannon, but in either case, I was attracted to her. She was emotionally unavailable and nothing really came of it, but it was the first time I mentioned to my mother that I did have attraction to people based on who they were, not their gender, and it was feasible for me to be with a girl. I didn't use the term bisexual yet. That would come later. But I had at least acknowledged that I could see myself with a girl and that there was attraction there. Even still, I mainly considered myself to be heterosexual. or at least verbalized it that way. It wasn't until, it's been about 2.5 years since Shannon moved back to Texas from Georgia. And shortly after she moved back, there were, again, two different guys that we were interested in, so we weren't really looking at each other romantically until we were. And we started dating actually on Thanksgiving Day of the year that she got here, 2 years ago. But if we're honest with ourselves, within a couple of months of her being here, we were acting like a couple. It just took us a while to acknowledge that. Now, I do want to mention, just because I feel it's relevant, even though it annoys Shannon a little, 4 years prior to her moving here, I did comment that I had feelings for her, and she told me it was never going to happen. And so I let that go. I didn't verbalize that to anybody else at the time. Anyway, so Shannon and I started dating, and even then, I did not want to say the word bisexual or lesbian. I had been a long-time supporter of the LGBT community. I had turned my back on the Christians because they didn't support LGBT rights. I had been to many a PFLAG meeting and fought very hard for LGBT rights, but I still considered myself a straight ally. But here I am now dating my best friend who's a girl. And I would just say, no, I'm straight. I just happen to have fallen in love with a girl. And Shannon would get so mad. She'd say, no, you're not straight because you're with me. If you're with me, you're not straight. But I didn't want to say the word. It was just, it had been so ingrained in me and so frowned upon, not by my family, well, not by my mother anyway, but by the society I grew up in. My mother was so cool. My mother was very understanding, and when I told her Shannon and I were together, it was a reaction of very much, well, it's about time. Y'all finally figured it out. So my mother was great. My adoptive dad was great. Like, they didn't care. It wasn't my family. It was the society I grew up in. I was scared to say the word. And finally, one day, I had given it a lot of thought, and I had gone over my history, and I realized I'm bisexual, and I have been my entire life. And if I'm honest with myself, I realized it in 7th grade. Which stands to reason. That's typically when you start noticing people of, whether if you're straight, of the other sex as attractive. You might see a cute boy in kindergarten, but generally speaking, you start puberty and sexual maturity around 7th grade. So it stands to reason that that's when I started to figure out I was bisexual. And once I said that word, I'm bisexual, I felt this freedom of accepting who I was and not fighting against myself anymore. It was a struggle that I didn't even realize that I was going through until I wasn't anymore. And I can tell you, it was not a choice to be bisexual. It was just who I am. And I didn't randomly choose to fall in love with my best friend. She just happens to be my soulmate and who I'm meant to be with. And for anybody to say that our love is wrong, you're wrong. Plain and simple. There's never been anything so right in my life. My marriage is wonderful and full of love and respect, and to the point of, well, if you're homosexual or bisexual, then you've been abused as a child. I have never been molested. I did go through some verbal abuse from my biological father, but I have an amazing adoptive father, and I had attraction to men in my past, but I've also had attraction to women in my past. I don't know how abuse plays into who I'm attracted to, especially given that the first time I was attracted to a woman, none of the verbal abuse or emotional abuse had been suffered yet. That came later in my life, so it's not a factor. So to say your sexuality is a choice is bullshit. It's not a choice. It's who you are. You didn't choose to be straight. You don't choose to be bi. You don't choose to be gay. You are who you are. You love who you love. And that's just the way it is. To go ahead and finish up my religious tale, it was in high school that I started to address other religions. And I started to dabble in Wicca, but not true Wicca, the witchy craft stuff that a lot of teenagers do dabble in. I'm not proud of that. Yes, I do believe in witchcraft. Yes, I believe in magic. No, I don't believe teenagers should be dabbling in things they don't understand. It's not a good idea. But I did, and I am not proud, and it was stupid. Not Wicca being stupid, but messing with things you don't understand and you're not educated in is stupid. And we were stupid kids, me and Shannon and another friend we had at the time. But through that stupidity, I actually studied the religion properly, and but I had to do it in secret because I lived with my biological father at the time, stupidly, and by extension, my stepmother, who claimed to be Baptist, although she was very judgmental and not a very good practicing Christian, and said that she knew everything about Wicca because she had watched Charmed, which I think is slightly more ignorant than my teenage stupidity, but I digress. So anything that I studied regarding Wicca, I had to do in secret because she saw it as satanic, which is really ironic considering that Satan is a Christian deity, truthfully. And I do believe this, the Church of Satan is a denomination of Christianity because Satan is a Christian figure. But that is for another video. So to say I believe in Satan is laughable because I don't believe in Christianity. I don't believe in heaven and hell. I believe in the Elysian Fields in Tartarus, but in the underworld. I also don't believe you burn forever in Tartarus. I believe it's more of a place of redemption, karma, and then you eventually make it to the Elysian Fields. I could go on about my faith, but what I believe is irrelevant to the story at this point. So anyway, I pretended to be Baptist to appease her. I would go to church, whatever. I hide my Wiccan books under my mattress. It got found one day. I got in big trouble. I kind of stopped studying for a while. Eventually, through my studies, I figured out that Wiccans are cool and all, but didn't really feel right to me. What had always really felt right was more just a general pagan religion that followed the Greek faith, the Greek gods and deities, and that had always felt more right to me. Just how I ended up becoming a pagan. And then somewhere in the midst of my 14 years with my first love, he is a Christian, Lutheran last I checked, and I wanted him to like me, so I tried to become Christian. I would go to church every Sunday on my own. I tried to believe what they said. I even tried to dress a little more conservatively. be a good Christian girl. And I even went and made a meeting with the church leader because I needed to reconcile my fight for LGBT rights with me trying to be Christian. It didn't reconcile, at least not at that church. Eventually, I realized it can't be something I'm not, and I am not Christian. So that was a failed attempt to try to force myself to be Christian. Since I've got married to someone who accepts me and loves me for who I am, who I love for who she is, I've accepted my sexuality and my religion and stopped fighting against it. I'm a much happier person. So I would say that's what I want for everybody, whether you're gay or straight or bisexual or transgender or Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Muslim or pagan or Satanist or agnostic or atheist or whatever you are, is find out who you are and be happy. Accept you for you, and to hell with what anybody else thinks. And I think you know in your heart who you are and what you believe. And whatever that may be, that's okay. As long as you're not harming anybody. And the Church of Satan actually doesn't believe in harming other people, just to be clear. I've researched that too, just for the hell of it. And you should really research things before you condemn them. So I did. And it too is a harm none religion, which I support any harm none religion or lack thereof in the case of atheists. Believe what you believe and love who you love. Life is too short to live with so much hatred. And who you love is not always a choice. When you find your soulmate, you know. And when you're attracted to somebody, you know. And you can't force attraction, just like you can't force religion. I know because I tried. So that's really all I have to say about that for today. I just wanted to tell my story, and hopefully it helps some other LGBT kid out there that's struggling because of the society they're growing up in. And I don't expect it to change the minds of any homophobes, but I'm here to tell you they're wrong. It's not a choice. You are who you are, and love is love, and love is wonderful. And as a final thought, that doesn't mean go fuck a goat. It means love between consenting adults. And I don't care if that means polygamy. If everybody involved in the polygamy is a consenting adult, more power to them. If they're happy, go for it. Consenting adults. Goat can't consent. So I just thought I'd throw that in there because that's another argument they like to use. Love between consenting adults, it's not wrong. It's everything that's right with the world.